He had asked the agency, in writing, for a plain, sturdy widow accustomed to hard work and disinclined toward foolishness. And Otto Klein stood on the depot platform at Clover Bottom, turning that letter over in his mind like a man checking a fence line for the break he already knows is there. Because the young woman climbing down carefully from the passenger car, in a traveling suit of good gray wool, with 4 match trunks, a hat box, and a small leather-bound prayer book clutched tight against her chest, was plainly none of those 3 things at all. Mr. Klein, she said his name carefully, as though she had practiced it on the long ride west, and dropped a small, formal curtsy that belonged in a parlor and nowhere on a farm platform smelling of coal smoke and manure. I am Celeste Fontaine. I believe you were expecting a Mrs. Prout, but she took ill at the crossing and could not continue, and the agency thought it best not to leave you standing here for nothing, so they sent me in her place. Otto looked at the 4 trunks, and the hat box, and the small worn prayer book, and the small gloved hands that had plainly never once held a hoe in their whole careful life, and said the only thing he could think to say, which was, "You ever seen a cow, Miss Fontaine?" "I have seen a great many pictures of them," she said, with a composure that struck him as either very brave or very foolish, "in a book on the animals of God's creation that Sister Agnes kept in the convent library. I understand they are generally quite gentle." Otto Klein had buried enough naive expectations in his 31 years to recognize another one standing in front of him in traveling gray, and he loaded the trunks onto his wagon without further comment, mostly because he could not, in that moment, think of a single word that would not come out unkind, and Otto Klein made it a point never to be unkind to a woman who had done nothing wrong except arrive. He had asked for plain sturdiness, because his own mother had been a delicate, town-bred woman who had never once taken to the isolation of Clover Bottom, and had left when Otto was 9, back to her people in the capital, unable to bear another season of mud and distance and silence. And Otto had grown into a man who believed, without ever examining the belief too closely, that a farmer's wife needed to be built of plainer, harder stuff than pretty manners or fine gray traveling suits, or she would break the same way his mother had broken and leave the same ragged hole behind her. He said none of this to Celeste on the ride home, only answered her careful questions about the fields and the weather in short, plain sentences, and watched her take in the long, empty miles of Clover Bottom with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between wonder and quiet dread. "It is very wide," she said finally, of the country itself, as the wagon rattled past mile after mile of new-turned earth and distant fence line with no other roof in sight. "I did not know land could be so wide and so empty of people both at once. Does that trouble you?" "Everything about the last 3 days has troubled me a little," Celeste admitted, with a frankness that caught him off guard, "but I did not come this far to be troubled out of trying." He said nothing to that, but he found himself, for the length of the rest of the ride, watching her out of the corner of his eye rather more than the road strictly required. Celeste had grown up at Sacred Heart, orphaned at 4, and raised by the sisters ever since, and she had loved the convent the way a person loves the only home they have ever known, without ever quite believing it was meant to be permanent. She had no dowry, no family to claim her, and no true calling toward the veil no matter how patiently Mother Superior waited for one to arrive. And when the letter came that spring saying a widow named Prout had backed out of a matrimonial arrangement at the last crossing, and the agency needed someone respectable to fill the place before the farmer lost his whole planting season waiting, Celeste had volunteered before she'd fully thought through what she was volunteering for. She had told herself, rattling west across 3 states in a train car, that a woman raised on discipline and scripture and hard, uncomfortable pews could surely learn whatever a farm required. She had not yet met a cow, Mother Superior had wept a little at the parting, which surprised Celeste more than anything else about the whole sudden arrangement, and had pressed into her hands, along with the prayer book, a small purse of coins saved from years of selling the convent's preserves, saying only that a woman ought to have something set by that was entirely her own, whatever came of the marriage. "You were never meant for the veil, child," Mother Superior had said. "Whatever I once hoped, and I have prayed a long while that God would show you the door meant for you instead of the one I kept trying to build for you myself." Celeste had carried those words the whole 3 states west, turning them over the way she turned over Scripture, and found in them, on the hardest days that followed, more courage than she'd expected a farewell to hold. She wrote to Mother Superior faithfully every second week that first month, careful letters that admitted to scalded wrists and overturned milk buckets, but not to the deeper fear underneath them, that she had traded one kind of uncertain future for another, and might yet prove unsuited to both. The first week disabused her of a great many convent-bred notions all at once. She scalded her wrist attempting to render lard, sent Otto's best laying hens into such a panic, trying to collect their eggs, that 2 of them did not lay again for a fortnight, and attempting to milk the mild-tempered old cow, named Bessie on the theory that gentleness alone ought to suffice, succeeded only in tipping herself backward off the stool into the very bucket she'd been meant to fill. The churning went little better. She worked the dasher with pious patience for the better part of an hour before Otto came in from the fields to find her nearly in tears over a churn of cream that stubbornly refused to become butter, only to discover, once he'd looked, that she had never once thought to check whether the cream had properly soured first, a fact no book on the animals of God's creation had troubled itself to mention. Sister Marth's kitchen never once required souring anything, Celeste said, mortified, wiping cream from her sleeve. Only patience and a steady arm, both of which I believe I have amply demonstrated this past hour to no purpose whatsoever. "You've the patience," Otto allowed, hiding whatever amusement he felt behind a carefully neutral face. "Just none of the knowing yet. Comes in time, same as everything else worth having ever does, or so my father always told me." "It isn't gentleness that's wanted," Otto told her, hauling her upright and trying, not entirely successfully, to keep the corner of his mouth from twitching. "It's the knowing where to put your hands." "Then teach me where to put them," Celeste said, wringing milk out of her apron with a dignity that impressed him rather more than the spill had dismayed him. "For I did not cross 3 states, and a river to be defeated by an animal Sister Agnes assured me, in writing, no less, was gentle by nature and easily managed by any patient hand." Word travels fast in farm country, and by the second week half of Clover Bottom knew that Otto Klein's mail-order bride had been raised by nuns, and could not tell a heifer from a bull calf, which was precisely the sort of story Hollis Vance, who farmed the next section over, and had never in his life passed up an opportunity to needle a neighbor, could not resist repeating at the feed store with considerable relish. Even the storekeeper's wife, generally a charitable soul, allowed that she'd heard the convent girl had asked, in perfect innocence, why the milk cow needed milking at all if she was already so evidently gentle, a question that made the whole store roar with laughter for a solid minute, once Hollis finished retelling it with suitable embellishment. "Give it a month, Otto," Hollis said, leaning on the counter with the satisfaction of a man who considers himself a shrewd judge of livestock and marriages both. "Convent girl like that'll be on the eastbound train before the corn's knee-high, and you'll be back to the agency for a proper widow, same as you should have held out for the first time. I'll wager you $5 on it." The first Sunday, at the little Clover Bottom church, half the congregation found some excuse to pass by the Klein pew for a closer look at the convent bride, and Celeste, aware of every eye on her plain gray dress and careful posture, held her chin high and greeted each of them, by name once introduced, in a voice that carried just enough convent-taught composure to make several of the more skeptical farm wives revise their expectations at least a little. Mrs. Vance herself, Holly's wife, remarked afterward to anyone who'd listened that the girl had manners enough for a governor's parlor, whatever she might lack in the barnyard, and that manners, in her experience, generally outlasted whatever the barnyard had to teach anyway. Otto did not take the wager, mostly because some stubborn part of him did not care to hear himself say aloud that he thought Holly's was very likely right. But he rode home that evening turning the bed over anyway, and found Celeste in the kitchen with a borrowed book on animal husbandry, propped open against the flour bin, reading by lamplight long after a sensible woman would have gone to bed, muttering something in French under her breath that he suspected was not entirely complimentary to the difficulties of a milk cow's anatomy. There was, too, the small matter of the agency's letter, which arrived that same week from a Mrs. Agatha Prine, reminding Mr. Klein in crisp, businesslike language that the arrangement carried a 30-day trial by the terms both parties had signed, after which either might declare the match unsuitable without further obligation, and requesting his honest assessment by return post. Otto folded the letter into his coat pocket and did not mention it to Celeste, though the not mentioning of it sat uneasily on him all that week, heavier than any honest word would have. What Otto had not accounted for, in his letter asking for plain sturdiness, was how much a woman raised on discipline could bring to bear once she set her mind to a thing properly. Celeste could not milk a cow to save her life that first week, but she could bake bread that made Holly Vance's own wife ask, blushing, for the recipe, having learned from Sister Marthe, who had run the convent kitchen for 40 years and tolerated no half-measures from anyone under her instruction. She could not yet tell a healthy hen from a sickly one, but she read Latin better than the traveling minister, and one wet evening, finding Otto squinting over his late father's account books by poor light, straining over sums that would not come right, she quietly took the ledger from him, checked his arithmetic twice, and found the error in 11 minutes that had cost him 3 sleepless nights. "You've a good head for figures," Otto said, startled into something almost like admiration. "The sisters were strict about arithmetic," Celeste said. Sister Agnes held that a woman who could not balance a column of numbers had no business claiming to balance anything else in her life either. She did not add that she had spent that whole day chasing a runaway pig through Holly Vance's cornfield, and had never in her life felt so thoroughly outmatched by a single uncooperative animal, though the shine of the day's small triumph with the ledger went some way toward mending her pride. He took to bringing her the accounts every few evenings after that, ostensibly because a second pair of eyes caught errors his own tired ones missed by lamplight, though in truth he had come to look forward to the quiet half-hour of her company over the numbers more than he cared to admit even to himself. She, in turn, found something steadying in being useful in a way that did not depend on her uncertain hands with livestock, and began, without quite meaning to, correcting his grammar in the same gentle, unrelenting way Sister Agnes had once corrected hers, until Otto took to teasing her that he'd traded one strict schoolmistress for another and come out the worse in the bargain, though he never once said it as though he minded. He took to teaching her properly after that, unhurried and plainspoken the way he did everything. He set her stool at Bessie's flank one gray morning and knelt beside her rather than standing over her, guiding her hands with his own until she felt, for the first time, the particular give-and-pull rhythm of it settle into her wrists instead of remaining a puzzle in her head. "Not a ringing motion," he said, low and patient. "A pressing one, top to bottom, easy as you please. She'll tell you plain enough if you've got it wrong. She has told me plain enough on several previous occasions, Celeste said dryly, and Otto laughed outright, a short surprised bark of a sound she came to realize over the following weeks. He did not offer easily or often, which made the earning of it feel rather like a small private victory each time. By the fourth attempt, the pail rang with a proper, steady stream instead of an apologetic trickle, and Celeste sat back on the stool with an expression of such open triumph that Otto found himself grinning back at her for considerably longer than the moment strictly required. He walked her through the henhouse of a morning after that, until she could read the birds' moods the way she'd once read scripture, by long attention rather than any natural gift. She did not stop making mistakes. She never would entirely, farm life being what it was, but the mistakes grew smaller and less frequent, and Otto found himself, somewhere in the passing weeks, looking forward to supper less for the food than for whatever wry, carefully worded observation about country life she'd have saved up to share with him over it. "You laugh different than I expected a farmer would," she told him one evening, watching him try and fail to keep a straight face over her account of losing an argument with a particularly opinionated rooster. "And you argue different than I expected a nun's girl would," he said, and she laughed at that, properly, the sound of it filling the small kitchen in a way the quiet convent corridors of her whole childhood never quite had, and Otto thought, watching her, that he had asked the agency for the wrong thing entirely and simply not known it at the time. There was a harder evening besides, near the third week, at a barn dance meant to welcome the season's new arrivals, where Celeste, still unsteady on unfamiliar ground in more ways than one, mistook the county custom of a lady choosing her own partner for the second dance as a grave impropriety, and stood so stiffly correct through the whole affair that two of the younger farm wives took to whispering behind their fans about the convent girl who plainly thought herself above the company. She overheard enough of it to flee to the porch rail afterward, mortified, and it was Otto who found her there, and rather than offering empty comfort, simply asked her to teach him instead the proper steps of whatever dances the sisters had permitted at Sacred Heart on feast days, and led her back inside to demonstrate them badly enough that half the room was laughing with them, rather than at her within the quarter hour. "You did not have to make a fool of yourself on my account," she told him afterward, though something in her voice had gone considerably warmer than her words strictly conveyed. "Wasn't only on your account," Otto said. "Man ought to know his own wife's ways same as she's learning his, seems only fair." It was the first time either of them had used the word wife aloud between themselves, and neither remarked on it, though both noticed. It was not, however, a clean or a swift turning. There came an evening near the middle of the 30 days when Celeste, exhausted and disheartened after a whole day spent failing to keep a broody hen from destroying half the flock's eggs out of pure spite, overheard Otto on the porch telling Holly's Vance, in a low and troubled voice, that he did not know if it was fair to hold a convent girl to a farmer's bargain, and that perhaps Mrs. Prine's 30 days were a mercy rather than a cruelty after all. She did not sleep that night, turning the overheard words over as she once might have turned over a difficult catechism, and came down the next morning with her spine very straight and her chin higher than Otto had yet seen it. "If you mean to send me back," she said, before he had even poured his coffee, "you will do me the courtesy of telling me so yourself, Otto Klein, and not deciding it over a fence rail with Holly's Vance, while I am left to learn of my own fate second-hand." "I said no such thing to Holly's," Otto said, startled and then, catching himself, honest. "I said I didn't know if it was fair to you, holding you to a bargain you maybe didn't understand the whole weight of when you signed it. That's a different thing than wanting you gone." I understood the weight of it a great deal better than you credit me for, Celeste said, and her voice, though it shook slightly, did not waver. I understood that I had no family, no dowry, and no true calling to the life the sisters had planned for me, and that this was the one door standing open when every other one in my life had already shut. I did not come 3 states west to be pitied out of a bargain by a kind man who thinks he is sparing my feelings. I came to make good on it, cow by cow and hen by hen, however long it takes me, unless you tell me plainly to my face that you do not want me here. Otto set his coffee down and looked at her a long moment, and whatever answer he had been rehearsing for Mrs. Prine's letter went entirely out of his head. I have never once said I didn't want you here, he said slowly. Truth is, Miss Fontaine, I've come to want you here a good deal more than I bargained on, and it's that, not your milking, that's had me lying awake nights. She had no ready answer for that, not one the convent had ever prepared her to give, and the two of them stood in the kitchen, a moment in a silence that felt, for the first time since her arrival, entirely comfortable rather than uncertain. Then answer Mrs. Prine honestly, Celeste said at last, some of the starch going out of her posture, and tell her whatever is true, even if the truth is only that we are both still finding our footing in this arrangement. I would rather know a plain truth from you than a kind evasion, Otto Klein, today and every day after. The truth, Otto said slowly, as though testing the shape of it aloud for the first time, is that I've watched you fail at near everything I asked of you these 3 weeks, and get back up every single time without once complaining to me that I hadn't warned you how hard it would be. I don't reckon Mrs. Prine's 30 days have got much bearing on what I actually think of you any more. Celeste found, hearing it, that she believed him entirely, and some old, careful guardedness in her chest finally loosened its grip for good. The 30th day, as it happened, arrived in the middle of the worst hailstorm Clover Bottom had seen in a decade, rolling in fast and black across the western fields, just as the wheat stood ready and heavy for cutting, threatening to flat a whole season's living into the mud inside the hour. Otto was already out with every hand he could muster, racing to get what could be cut, and the rest covered against the worst of it, when Celeste, without waiting to be asked, tied her apron tight, grabbed a scythe she had never once held with any confidence, and went out into the field beside him. You don't know how, Otto shouted over the rising wind, more from fear for her than any doubt of her will. Then I will learn it in the next 5 minutes, same as I learned everything else since I arrived, she shouted back, and matched his rhythm stroke for stroke, clumsy at first and then, as the hail began to spit cold against her back with a fierce, focused speed that surprised them both. The wind rose to a low, constant roar, flattening whole rows of standing wheat before the blades could even reach them. And once, when a hailstone the size of a knuckle caught her hard across the temple and staggered her half a step, Otto was at her side in an instant, one arm thrown protectively over her head and shoulders, shouting for her to get to the wagon and shelter, and Celeste, dazed but unbowed, shook her head hard and picked the scythe back up from where it had fallen. I am not finished, she shouted back over the wind, blood beating faintly at her hairline where the ice had struck her. And neither, I think, is this field. And something in the fierce, unyielding set of her face in that moment told Otto, more plainly than any words could have, exactly what kind of woman he had actually been given, whatever he'd thought he'd asked for. Hollis Vance himself came riding hard through the first stinging pellets of ice to lend a hand, having seen the black sky from his own porch, and known exactly whose wheat stood most exposed, and found, wading into the field, the convent girl he'd wagered against working alongside Otto Klein with a grim, unbowed determination that made him feel, for the first time in the whole affair, thoroughly ashamed of his $5 bet. They saved perhaps two-thirds of the crop between the three of them and every hired hand Otto could summon, working until the hail turned to a drenching rain, and the rain finally slackened to nothing. And when it was over, Celeste stood swaying in the ruined field with her good gray traveling suit, the only fine thing she had left of her old life, torn at the hem and soaked through and utterly beyond repair, and laughed, a little wildly, at the pure absurdity of how far she had come from a convent, libraries, gentle pictures of cattle. "You didn't have to do that," Otto said, low, coming to stand beside her in the wrecked field, rain still dripping from his hat brim. "I told you I meant to make good on the bargain," she said. "Cow by cow, hen by hen, and now, it seems, hailstorm by hailstorm." She looked at him then, exhausted and soaked and entirely unlike the composed young woman who had stepped off the train with a prayer book clutched to her chest, and found that she did not mind in the least who she had become in his fields these 30 days. Hollis Vance paid Otto his $5 at the feed store the following week, with considerably better humor than Otto had expected of him, declaring loudly enough for half the store to hear that he had never in his life been so glad to lose a wager, and that any woman who'd stand in a hailstorm swinging a scythe she'd learned to use that same afternoon deserved better odds than he'd given her from the start. Mrs. Vance, for her part, called on Celeste the following Sunday with an apology for the barn dance whispers, and an offer to teach her the finer points of dressing a hen for market, an offer Celeste accepted with the same open grace she seemed to bring to every fresh humiliation the county still had waiting for her. Celeste wrote to Mother Superior that same week with news of the hailstorm and the wager, and the small, hard-won respect she had finally earned from Clover Bottom, and received back a short reply that said only that she had always suspected God's plans for Celeste ran through a wheat field rather than a chapel, and that she was glad, at last, to have been proven right about something. Otto asked her properly that same evening, on the porch where the whole uneven business had begun 30 days before, with Mrs. Prine's letter finally answered and put to rest in terms that left no doubt at all about his honest assessment. "I asked the agency for a plain, sturdy widow," he said, turning his hat in his hands the way he never usually bothered to, "because I thought that was the only kind of woman built to last out here. I was wrong about near everything in that letter, Celeste, except maybe the sturdy part, and I'd be obliged if you'd consider staying on as my wife, proper, rather than my bride on trial." "The sisters always said God's plans rarely matched the ones we wrote out for ourselves," Celeste said, slipping her hand into his. "And I begin to think, Otto Klein, that this was rather a better plan than either the agency or I had any right to expect." They were married the following Sunday in the small Clover Bottom church, with Hollis Vance's wife baking the cake from Celeste's own convent recipe and half the county turning out to see the nun's girl, as they'd taken to calling her fondly by then, Mary the farmer who had very nearly sent her home, and thanked heaven every day after that he hadn't. Celeste wore, at her own insistence, not a new gown but the mendied gray traveling suit she had arrived in, torn hem stitched invisibly back into place by her own careful hand, because she said she wished to be married in the very clothes that had first proven she could stand a hailstorm, a hen, and a whole skeptical county, and come out the other side of all three still standing. Otto gave her, in place of the ring he'd had no chance yet to properly buy, the small carved wooden cow he'd whittled in secret over 3 quiet evenings, its proportions a little lopsided, and its horns slightly too long, and told her it was the truest likeness he could manage of the first cow she'd ever laid eyes on, so that she would never forget how far a woman who'd once known them only from pictures had come. Celeste kept it on the mantel the whole of her life after, alongside the small leather prayer book Mother Superior had pressed into her hands at the parting. Two gifts from two different homes that had each, in their own way, taught her exactly who she was capable of becoming, and neither of which she would have traded, not even on the hardest of those first uncertain 30 days, for the quiet, settled life she'd once imagined the convent alone might offer her.